So welcome back. We're progressing through these chapters in these 3 chapters in Gideon, and I think we're just getting to some of the good parts. So let's jump in. I recently read a book called Big Friends, How We Keep Each Other Close. Strange title. By 2 women. Aminatau Sow, S-O-W, is one of the authors, and I'll spell the first name because it's a hard name to pronounce. A-M-I-N-A-T-O-U, Aminatau Sow, S-O-W, and Anne Friedman, easier. The book was a little too millennial for my taste, but the book had one great chapter in it called Shine Theory. S-H-I-N-E, Shine Theory, in which the authors talked about this principle. Shine Theory states that I don't shine if you don't shine. In other words, we would do well to allow or to help others around us to look good because it makes us look good in turn. You are only as good as the people around you. Your friends are a reflection of your brilliance, your good taste, your talent. This is in contrast to the theory, and I don't know if this theory has a name given to it, that if you pick friends who are mediocre, it will make you stand out more. I don't know what we would call that, the dull theory or something. And we're going to see this shine theory in this section of Judges chapter 7. We're going to see this play out in a very strange and unique way, with God once again orchestrating events and putting them beyond Gideon's control. I hope you're noticing that last week and today, keep in mind and keep looking for the way that God is moving in such a way that Gideon really doesn't have control over what's going on. Gideon is forced to look to the Lord for guidance and leadership. And what we're going to talk about today is another one of those great stories surrounding Gideon that's often, I think, overlooked and not dug into enough. And so this morning we're going to dig into it a little bit and see the jewels that are there. I think this is a really rich story that's there for our spiritual edification. Because I think it goes without saying. And why do people always say it goes without saying and then say? But I'm doing that. I hope we're each gleaning lessons for our own lives when we're studying these Bible stories that we're looking into. Because that, to me, is the beauty of Scripture. There's something applicable for each one of us in the circumstances that we're looking into, that we can apply to our own lives, whatever our situation happens to be. We can kind of look at the story that we're studying and we can kind of see, gee, that really applies to this particular aspect of my life right now. So as we talk about Gideon's circumstances this morning, for example, be aware of what God has for you in your circumstances today. What does he want you to leave this classroom setting with that will enhance or change your life? So personalize it. I hope you're personalizing what we're talking about this morning. So we're starting in verse 1 of chapter 7 of Judges. Then Jerubbaal, which is Gideon's new name, remember, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Herod. Now that's not the Herod in the New Testament. This is H-A-R-O-D is the transcription of the Hebrew, which today in Israel is called Gideon's Fountain. There's actually a place in Israel. It's called Gideon's Fountain, and it's a spring on the southern border of the Jezreel Valley, which is, again, I'm not going to put a map up, but you can go look this up. You can see exactly the location that this is taking place, where this is taking place. So this well of Herod is where they go. They get up early and they go in camp at this well of Herod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh, M-O-R-E-H is the transcription, which is on the northeast side of the Jezreel Valley, in the valley, okay? So verse 1 kind of sets the location for what's going to happen next. And you know, it must be important to set the location for the chapter to kind of lead with this information. Why do you think this is the first information we're given in this chapter? So let's unmute everybody, Betty, and kind of raise your hand if you have an idea. You know, nothing is kind of in Scripture is happenstance. Why do you think it's important to lead with this particular kind of geographical information in chapter 1 in verse 1 of chapter 7? What are we told in this verse? Anybody? Anybody want to hazard an answer? There's no, you know, you're not going to get, yes.
I think it's interesting that they rose early and they all did at the same time.
Okay.
Because I don't want to get up early ever.
Yeah, I think the rising early kind of denotes an enthusiasm. They're ready to go. I mean, let's get up early, and yeah, most people would say, you know, we'll get up when we get up. Okay, they rose early. All the people, all the whatever army Gideon or Jerubbaal had pulled together were kind of one accord, right? It doesn't say, yeah, there were some of them that said, you know what, I'm going to sleep in. They were all of one accord. They all rose, all the people who were with him rose early, and they all went to a specific location. And it's, if you know this area, and again, it would be great if we could do some visual aids, but it's a higher area than where the Midianites were. So they could look down and see what must have been very off-putting, which were hundreds and hundreds of tents of the Midianites. They're ready, but they're ready for battle, and we know exactly where they're located. And then basically in verse 3, God said, in verses 2 and 3, God says, not so fast. Let me read verses 2 and 3, because there's a little bit of humor. If you were there, it wouldn't have been funny, but for us reading this, it's got a little kind of a tinge of humor. And the Lord, in verses 2 and 3, and the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained.
Wow.
Now on the one hand, I said this is kind of humorous. There's a battle about to be fought, and God says to Gideon, send home anyone who's afraid. Now, what? This is a very interesting military technique, don't you think, that God sets out? Obviously, if you can add simple numbers, there are 32,000 men who have gathered to serve with Gideon from all the outlying tribes and families, which is really rather amazing when you think about it, that he's pulled together 32,000 man army. That's pretty amazing in and of itself, which God says, that's not going to work. Gideon must have been very proud, thinking, wow, you know, I've got 32,000 warriors, you know, not warriors, because these are farmers. These are not warriors. He didn't see himself as a leader of men. We know that about Gideon. He doesn't see himself as a warrior. He's probably kind of going, wow, this is pretty amazing that I've got this many Israelites ready to fight this very well-known military, the well-known military prowess of the Midianites, whose army, we don't have the number yet in the text, but we're going to see it. They are 135,000 strong. Now, that's about 5 times as strong. And you could do some pretty brutal damage, 135,000 to 32,000. And that's apparently what God is concerned about. If he were to let you, I mean, you know, Gideon's saying, wow, I'm pretty shocked that I have that many men following me. And God is thinking, if he were to let those 32,000 men go out and fight against the Midianites and the Amalekites, and if the Israelites should by some miracle turn out to be victorious, who would get the credit for that victory? God is saying the Israelites themselves. And Gideon, as their leader, or as they were calling him now, Jerubbaal, which we saw last week means contend with Baal or let Baal plead, which was the name they gave him in our last lesson because he tore down the altar, remember, and burned down the altar of Baal. And he was now considered somewhat of a hero. So Gideon's kind of like, whoa, this is kind of cool, you know? He's kind of flexing his muscles and seeing himself in a new light. He would be riding on the shoulders of the soldiers, the army that he's put together, and they would be having ticker tape parades for him. And all thought of God, of Jehovah, would be forgotten, which, if you remember, is what got the Israelites in trouble in the first place. They turned away from God, from Jehovah, and they turned to other gods, pagan gods like Baal. And that's why they're in the predicament that they're in. How things change in our lives sometimes, right? Gideon snuck out in the middle of the night and did what God asked him to do by destroying the altar of Baal, of this pagan god. But it wasn't this great heroic feat, was it? It was very much kind of in the night, and he was kind of trembling in his sandals. But you know, you got to give him credit. He obeyed, didn't he? He did it. He did what he was told, and that's saying something. But now God is going to continue to press Gideon into more service. And Gideon, ever cautious, we saw last week, he put out this fleece, and then he put out another fleece and asked for another sign from God to make very sure that he's doing what God wants him to do and not acting in his own initiative. And again, in one sense, this is very commendable that he doesn't want to go ahead of God. It's smart not to get ahead of God. But in another sense, it's kind of a little bit cowardly, isn't it? You kind of got the feeling last week that he was maybe hoping that when he put out one or the other of those fleeces, that maybe it wasn't gonna happen, and he could say, oh, well, that was probably something my own mind created, and we can all go home, including himself. My work is done here. You know, I tore down the altar. I did what God asked me to do. I put out the fleece, and you know, it didn't happen, and so I'm off the hook. But God, you know, you can't do that with God, can you? I mean, unfortunately, he knows what we're thinking and what we're scheming. And so God obliged him by doing exactly what Gideon asked for twice. So this business of praying for a fleece, a sign, as I said last week, I think it's something that we all struggle with. you know, I've kind of had this conversation with people recently because it's been on my mind, asking questions like, have you ever prayed for a sign from God? And if so, what happened and how did it work out? And then it's interesting to kind of listen to the stories that people tell you in response. And, you know, ladies, the answers were all over the place. Some people said, you know, I put out a fleece and I never got an answer. Some people said, you know, yeah, I got my answer. It wasn't the answer I was hoping for, but I did get a fleece. But Gideon, in our story from last week, twice he got the answer. And he's very certain now that he's supposed to do, he knows how to proceed. So here we are in chapter 7. He's got 32,000 men ready to fight the enemy. And he's probably scratching his head and thinking, how did I get here? This is so not me. It's like, you know, we've all had this happen, haven't we? Where all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation that kind of crept up on you. And you wonder, how can I get out of this? How can I get out of this gracefully and still look spiritual, look godly? But I really don't want to do this. I guess I'm sure Gideon's thinking, okay, I guess if I have to, I'll lead these 32,000 men. They're not really military men, and neither am I, but I'll lead them into battle against the Midianites. And I'm looking out over into this valley where they're camped, and I see hundreds of tents, which means there's lots and lots of soldiers, and I see camels. Remember we talked about camels were the tanks of that day, and there's probably lots of camels parked in the camel shed. These guys are soldiers. These are warriors, and they've got weapons. Remember, the Israelites, they don't have weapons.
I didn't do it.
What? Oh.
Okay, we lost you.
You lost me?
No, you're good, John. You're good.
We're okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And then God says to Gideon, to top it all off, not so fast. You've got too many men, and I'm not happy with that, because then if you win, all the glory will go to you and your men and not me. So now notice the wording in verse 2. The people who are with you are too many for me, meaning God, to give the Midianites into their hands. What do you notice about this statement? Who's going to decide who wins the upcoming battle? God. Yeah, there's no question in that verse about who's going to decide the victory. It's not Gideon, it's not the Israelites, and it's certainly not the Midianites. The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands. The battle is the Lord's. You know, this is another one of those themes of scripture that we see over and over again, but I think we often miss this. We see it, for example, in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 15, where enemies came to fight against King Jehoshaphat. And we're told, and here's the verse, listen, all you of Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat, thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid nor dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. That's such a great verse, isn't it? It's 2 Chronicles 20:15. Boy, that's a verse to read to yourself every day. What a great reminder for us all. And back in Judges 7:2, it is God who decides who is going to win or lose any particular battle, whatever that battle may look like. Ladies, we should never forget that. We're not talking here only about battles that consist of warfare, are we? We're talking about whatever kind of battles life brings your way. Health battles or financial battles or marriage and relationship battles. Battles are battles, no matter what shape or form they take. And the battle is not yours, but God's. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this thought and this verse, Judges 7:2, very comforting, very reassuring. And 2 Chronicles 20:15. Our friend Gideon is going to learn this lesson in this short section that we're going to study today of chapter 7. And it's kind of fascinating to watch. So there's something about the size of Gideon's army that makes Jehovah do something extraordinary, as we see in verse 2, because he knows that with a large army, when the Midianites are defeated, the Israelites are likely to say, wow, we really beat the britches off the enemy. Aren't we spectacular? Didn't we do well? Does God understand human behavior? You bet he does. That's exactly what we would do. I know that's what I would do if I were leading the troops and we won. I would say, wow, my army did really well.
Right.
We would take all the credit. And what happens when we lose at something? Don't we blame God?
Blame God.
Yep, we blame God. It's his fault that I'm too slow or too weak or too poor or too whatever. But boy, we sure are great when we win. We hardly ever remember to give God the credit when he deserves when we're victorious. And God knows this, obviously, full well. So here's God's plan to prevent this from happening. Look at verse 3. Now, therefore, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. Now I want to stop in the middle of verse 3 and take in what is happening here. God is having Gideon say, if you're afraid, if you fear the upcoming battle with the Midianites, feel free to go home right now. Now, this isn't something that usually is said to soldiers about to face a fierce battle. Can you imagine Napoleon Bonaparte saying this to his troops at Waterloo in 1815 before their defeat at the hands of the British? Or at 1863's Battle of Gettysburg, which was the largest number of lives lost in the Civil War? If you're afraid of what's coming, just leave. Or the very lengthy Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 43 in World War II, where over 2.5 million men died. 2.5 million. And there were half again as many injured. If before these battles had begun, and think of all the wars, all the other wars, I just picked a couple, the commanding officers had said to the fighting men, you know what? If any of you are fearful and afraid, turn and depart and go home. Get away from the battle scene. What do you suppose would have happened?
They'd all leave.
They would all leave. Many, if not all, would have fled to safety. That's the knee-jerk reaction of men when their lives are threatened. It's that fight or flight reaction. Right. And flight is what I think all of us would do. I mean, if given the choice to turn and go home to safety or to risk your life in a battle, in a war, maybe a war, you know, think of the Vietnam War, and so many soldiers probably didn't even believe in it. War is not something that men take to comfortably or naturally. I've often thought that if I had been born a man, I would not have been welcomed serving in the armed forces during a war and having to face a battle of any kind. How about you? Would you have, ladies, would you have welcomed serving in a war, during a war? Boy, no. I think that's high risk. The anticipation of either being shot at and wounded or killed, or inflicting, you know, a wound or a fatality on someone else, that's horrifying. I think that's a horrifying prospect. I probably would have been one of those who, in Gideon's pulled together army would have said, see ya, going on now. I find it interesting that the nation of Israel is one of the few in the modern world that calls for mandatory service in their armed forces of women. Because traditionally women are not considered up for battle and warfare. So, I think that's really unusual. Does anybody know of any other country where military service is mandatory for women? I can't think of another country. Would you have stayed or gone if you had gotten Gideon's offer, allowing you to flee and go home?
Oh,
Gone out. I'd be gone.
Yeah,
Me
go
too.
home. Most of us would have gone home. So 22,000 of the men left, and
1/3 of them.
10,000 remained of Gideon's army. 2/3 left, and 1/3 remained to fight. That's
However, if
what-
they went home, they wouldn't be protected.
well, but yeah, that's the risk they're probably willing to take. But I think it's considering that it could have been worse. I think that's pretty good that 10,000 were left. At least he was left with 10,000 fighting men. So perhaps things aren't too dire. But the plot thickens, or the thick plottens, as they say. There's verse 4. But the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. I'm sure Gideon's going, oh, thank you very much. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, notice that God's just speaking to Gideon like, I'm gonna give you this message to say. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and of whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So God has yet another culling procedure to trim down Gideon's army from 10,000 men, now it's 10,000, to one that's even smaller. So he brought the people down, Gideon brought the people down to the water. I don't know whether it's a stream or a pond or a small lake. It's a body of water. And the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. We have a cartoon drawing of what that looked like. So here's what that looked like. Betty's going to show us. There we go. So can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So you see the men that are kneeling with their faces in the water. Those guys go home. You understand? So you notice that there's 3 to 1 of those, and see the guy who's kind of crouching and he's got the water in his hand and he's up. Now can you unmute everybody, Betty?
I think they're unmuted.
Okay, you guys are unmuted. So tell me, what is God seeing? Okay, you can put us back. What's God seeing in the guy who's got his hand up to his mouth and is crouching and not, bent over the water? What's the objective there that God is seeing in terms of letting those 3 guys go home?
I don't know.
What would be this is one of those, it's interesting. There are things like the fleece, the two fleece that Gideon put out that are still unresolved thousands of years later, and this is another one. What's the difference? Why would God send the guys who were down on their hands and knees with their faces dipped in the water like a dog? Why would he send those guys home and
They
keep.
want to watch it.
Right. You
Right.
notice that the guy who's got some water in his hand,
Mhm.
like this, like cupped in his hand, he can look
He's
around.
watching.
Mhm.
He's a more astute, aware warrior than the guys who just are down lapping like a dog. So there's a military rationale for that. That God is saying, you know, let the rest of them go home in peace. I don't want those guys. This is a very famous passage, a very famous kind of iconic picture, but it's people have not, I don't think people have spent a lot of time kind of talking. What's that all about? It's just another way to kind of cull the guys who would be the better warriors from the guys that are just the kind of the idiots that you want to say, don't do that. That's not the way that a warrior would behave. If the enemy comes attacking and you're down there with your face in the pool, you're not going to see him. So it's an interesting division. So that's what God's doing. It shows you how much God operates, and that sometimes we don't think about what he's all about. But it shows us that he's always in charge. God's always in charge. He's always in control. This is his plan from the get-go. He hasn't, have you noticed, Gideon doesn't have any say in this. He doesn't say, you know what, I really, can I say I don't like this plan? Can I offer up a suggestion, or can I throw something out there to you, Jehovah? That's not what's going on here. He's just doing, and good on him, he's being obedient to what God's telling him to do. So we see why, you know, it makes sense why God is eliminating, but now it's like God's gotten this down to 300. He's now eliminated over 9,000 more people. I mean, you thought 10,000 people, 10,000 warriors against 135,000 was really, you know, an unfair advantage. Now there's 300 Israelites against 135,000. That's a ratio. Now I cheated because I found this mathematics someplace else. It's less than 1% of his original army.
Wow.
And the ratio is now about 400 Midianite soldiers to 1 Israelite soldier. 400 to 1. That's a pretty devastating statistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now Gideon can only trust in God because there's nothing else to trust in. And then it gets really weird. If you thought it wasn't weird up till now, in the first 7 verses of chapter 7, verse 8, so the people took provisions. Now, remember, they don't have a lot of provisions, do they? Because they're, you know, things are, you know, food is pretty sparse. Whatever their provisions, we're not told what they are, but we have to assume that they don't have a lot of provisions. The people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands. Now, my question is, where in the heck did they get 300 trumpets? They've got trumpets. Where did they go to? Trumpets R Us? Down the street somewhere? I mean, did they go to Amazon and just do a huge order? Amazon Prime delivered the next day? I don't know. But they had trumpets. And he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. So now you've got 300 men. The good news is they needed a lot less food. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So now they still have this view of all these tents. It's still, you know, which now is more and more formidable of, golly, now there's 300 of us. So these 300 men gathered their essentials for battle and their weapons. What are their weapons? Remember, we talked about what weapons do they have?
Trumpets.
Trumpets.
They have farm implements. They've got spades and hoes and pitchforks and sticks. They don't have weapons. They don't have swords and spears and anything like what the Midianites have. They don't have actual weapons of war. The Israelites are literally, as my granddaughter would say, literally winging it. So this is a real makeshift army. When I get to heaven, one of my questions is going to be, where did they get those 300 trumpets? I've written that down in my little, moleskin. If we can take our moleskin little folders with us, I'm going to open that up and say, where did those 300 trumpets come from? I'm so curious. So now there's 300 instead of 32,000. And God is now finally content. God says, okay, now we've got the army that I wanted. But God is, Gideon's being obedient. I mean, you gotta admire Gideon, because first of all, he stayed. He could have said, you know what? I think I'm going home. Why don't we get my second in command to take over? And those 300 men are going to prepare for battle. And below them, as I said, in the valley, they can see these endless tents. And they're waiting for the battle to begin. And what must have been going through the minds and hearts of Gideon and these 300 men? Can you imagine? They must have been looking around at each one of them, at the 299 others, and thinking, well, if you don't shine, I don't shine. Come back to the shine theory. If you don't do well, I'm sure not going to do well. We're in this together. I mean, the shine theory is at play here. If you don't survive, I probably won't survive the oncoming battle. This is the shine theory at its most pertinent and fatal. Have you ever been in a situation where you really had to rely on the people around you to shine because your life depended on it? People in battle, soldiers, often tell stories of this kind of shine theory. The senator from Illinois, Tammy Duckworth, have you ever read her story of, she was a helicopter pilot, which is in Afghanistan, very unusual for a woman to begin with. And the helicopter was shot down. I don't know if any of you have read her story, and both of her legs were shot off. And she was rescued.
I'm gonna forward this to you.
What? Oh, and she was rescued she was saved from the burning helicopter once it crash landed by the two men that were in the helicopter with her. I mean, they pulled her to safety and literally saved her life. And I read a quote of hers that I think will stay with me for the rest of my life. She said, I want to live my life so that those two men never have cause to regret saving my life. And I thought, boy, that's a statement of integrity, that somebody said, that's the way I want to live the rest of my life, so that they never regret having saved my life. And you hear stories of people in the pitch of battle, or in a crisis, in the Twin Towers situation, when firemen and police officers saved people's lives and just did these heroic saves of people's lives at great risk to themselves. That's the shine theory at work. And they stared down at the valley filled with tents and soldiers, and they tried to sleep to prepare for the upcoming battle. What do you think their faith in God was like that evening before the battle? Was it solid or was it flimsy?
It'll be
Probably,
solid.
yeah, probably pretty solid. And more to the point, what did God do to come to their aid? Because as we've seen by now, God has already come along beside Gideon to help him and help his men, even when they didn't notice it. So there's even more to this story, and a really huge piece that's still part of this puzzle before the battle. It's just an incredible piece that comes up in the middle of chapter 7 for next week. So come back next week to see what God does. It's amazing to me how God wants this battle, wants this army of the Israelites pared down, but he's not leaving them to their own devices. He's going to give them, next week we'll see this assurance that he's with them. And so you can read ahead. I always want you to read ahead. These men, Gideon is growing more and more comfortable in his own skin and in his faith in God and his reliance on God. So this is the night before this battle, and God's going to do something with Gideon that's even more amazing than what he's already done. It just keeps getting better and better. He's not finished doing for Gideon to make sure Gideon knows that the battle is God's, not Gideon's. And this next sign that he's going to show Gideon is perhaps even more amazing, if you can believe it, than what we've already seen. So come back next week, and you'll just be blown. I mean, the story just builds. You couldn't do any better in a movie. I mean, it's just you couldn't write this stuff in a Hollywood script and make it any more tense and dramatic. So next week we'll see what God does, and it'll take us into what happens in the battle.